May 1945. The early morning mist clung to the fields outside Southampton, curling around the rows of olive-drab trucks like ghosts of battles past. John Ashford, a young logistics officer recently returned from the front lines of Northwest Europe, walked between the vehicles, his boots crunching on frost-hardened mud. Victory had come at last. The war in Europe was over, Hitler dead, and the streets of London rang with the jubilation of a nation freed from terror. Yet here, in the silent parks that stretched for miles across Britain, there was no celebration, only a sense of unease, a quiet tension that matched the chill in the air. The trucks stood in perfect rows, their paint chipped and faded from years of service, engines silent now, yet their presence was impossible to ignore. John ran his hand along the hood of a GMC cargo lorry, feeling the ridges of metal worn smooth by hands that had fought in the deserts of North Africa and the frozen fields of France. These machines had carried men, ammunition, and hope across continents, surviving mines, mud, and shellfire. And yet, despite their vital role, Britain did not own them. They were American property loaned under the Lend-Lease program, and the Americans wanted them back or money for them. John's stomach tightened at the thought. How could a war-weary country, 6 years drained by conflict, possibly pay for the lifeblood of its own victory? He walked on, passing a line of Dodge weapons carriers, their canvas tops torn and frayed. One vehicle still bore the faint marks of shrapnel, reminders of a battle in Italy that John had never seen but knew well from reports. He paused by a Studebaker US 6, its tires cracked but sturdy, the engine block shining faintly under the rising sun. Somewhere in the distance, the cries of children celebrating V-Day drifted over the hills. They didn't know that the trucks which had carried their fathers home were now symbols of a new, far more complex battle. One fought not with bullets, but with papers, negotiations, and money. At the edge of the depot, a small group of mechanics huddled around a map spread on the hood of a diamond tank transporter. Their leader, Sergeant Peter Cunningham, was an older man, gray at the temples but still sharp-eyed, pointing to locations across Europe. "We've got trucks scattered from France to Belgium, Italy to Palestine," he said, voice low. "And now they're telling us the Americans want payment. Do they realize we've used these trucks to win the war?" John shook his head. He had watched men in North Africa and Italy work miracles with these machines, converting them into ambulances, mobile workshops, and radio vans. He had seen a GMC haul artillery over roads that were barely more than tracks. Now, the trucks sat waiting for decisions that would decide their fate, and the fate of Britain's struggling economy. Each lorry was a testament to years of ingenuity and endurance, yet each also represented an impossible financial burden. Britain's reserves of foreign currency were critically low. Food imports had to be prioritized. Yet the Americans' figures were clear: £400 for a truck in good condition, £250 for fare, £100 for worn-out vehicles. 500,000 trucks multiplied by these sums was beyond comprehension. As the sun climbed higher, warming the metal roofs of the trucks, John's thoughts turned to the men who had driven them in battle. He remembered Corporal Davies, who had lost a leg in Normandy, sitting behind the wheel of a Chevrolet, smiling as if the truck itself was an extension of his body, and Private Thompson, who had spent nights repairing engines under a crescent moon in the North African desert, the smell of oil and sweat mingling in the heat. All of them had relied on these machines, trusted them to deliver food, ammunition, and hope across unforgiving landscapes. And now those same trucks were silent, inert, and threatened with disappearance. John wandered deeper into the depot, where some vehicles showed the wear of nearly 80,000 miles of service. Rust streaked their sides, tires were worn thin, yet each had a story embedded in its steel frame. He imagined the journeys, winding through the bombed streets of Berlin, traversing the muddy fields of Flanders, climbing the steep passes of the Apennines. Every dent, every scratch, was a memory of soldiers' lives, of triumphs and losses, of nights spent under the stars with engines humming like a lullaby. By mid-morning, the park was alive with activity. Clerks moved between trucks with clipboards, mechanics checked engines, and guards patrolled the perimeter. John watched a young driver, barely out of school, open the door of a Dodge and run his hand along the steering wheel. "I never thought I'd see one of these in real life," he murmured. John smiled faintly. He knew the boy didn't understand that each vehicle was a lifeline, a relic, a bargaining chip in a post-war game of politics and survival. John paused, looking across the depot, imagining the future. Some trucks would be kept for military use, others sold to civilian ministries, some scrapped or abandoned overseas. They would reshape towns, farms, and forests, and even appear on the roads of Germany, repainted and repurposed. But the majority, the silent, weathered 500,000, would vanish, swallowed by time, rust, and bureaucracy. And yet, in that moment, standing among the rows of machines that had carried nations to victory, John felt a quiet pride. These trucks had survived the chaos of war, borne the weight of human ambition, and now, even in stillness, they carried the story of Britain's resilience. Victory had come, yes, but it had brought a mountain of trucks, and with it, a new challenge, as daunting as any battlefield. He touched the hood of the nearest GMC, feeling the cold metal, and whispered, almost to himself, "We may not own you yet, but we will remember what you did." By July 1945, the fields outside Dunnington were quiet, but the silence was uneasy. Rows of American trucks stretched as far as the eye could see, their engines cold, their tires caked in mud from years of battle. Lieutenant Edward Carver trudged along the line, the letter from Washington still fresh in his mind. The Americans wanted payment, full or partial, for every single vehicle. The sums were staggering. Britain was bankrupt, yet returning the trucks would cost more than they were worth. Each vehicle was a lifeline and a liability at the same time. Mechanics moved from one GMC to the next, checking engines that had hauled artillery over Normandy's battered roads, that had crossed deserts, rivers, and snowfields. Some trucks were nearly new, only lightly worn. Others were scarred by 80,000 miles of service, dented, scratched, and exhausted. Every vehicle had a story, every dent a memory of men who had risked everything. And now, they were trapped in a new battlefield. Finance, bureaucracy, and diplomacy. Edward met with Sergeant Cunningham at a depot office, maps spread across a table. "We can't pay for all of them," Cunningham said, voice low. "Shipping them back would bankrupt us. Keeping them without paying, the Americans won't allow it." Edward nodded grimly. They were caught between a rock and a hard place. Their country needed the trucks for reconstruction, for food, for medicine, for everything, but the Treasury could not meet the demands. Outside, the trucks gleamed in the weak summer sun, a haunting reminder of the paradox of victory. The war was over, but the battle over these machines had only begun. Guards patrolled, clerks recorded serial numbers, and mechanics prepared for the endless inspections and valuations that would decide which trucks could stay and which would be lost forever. Edward walked past a Studebaker US 6, thinking of the nights spent under the stars in France, repairing engines with fellow soldiers. That same truck now faced a future of uncertainty, a victim of post-war reality rather than enemy fire. Across Britain, the same scene played out. Depots near Southampton, Liverpool, and elsewhere filled with 500,000 trucks, each waiting for a decision that could reshape the country. Every pound spent on retaining them was a pound not spent on feeding a starving population or rebuilding shattered cities. Every delay in negotiation left the vehicles exposed to the weather, slowly deteriorating, rust forming on once proud machines. Edward realized that while guns had fallen silent, the true cost of war was only beginning to be tallied. He paused at the hood of a GMC, the metal cold under his hands. The vehicle had survived battles, mud, and fire. Now it waited for papers, for decisions, for diplomacy to decide whether it would continue to serve or disappear. Edward looked down the endless rows, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. The war was over, yes, but Britain was trapped, caught in a web of circumstance where every decision carried consequences as heavy as any battlefield victory. By autumn 1945, the rain had stopped, but the mud clung stubbornly to Edward Carver's boots as he strode across the depot at Chilwell. Britain's 500,000 trucks still waited, silent and imposing, while the Treasury's ledgers groaned under the weight of numbers that no post-war economy should bear. Weeks of tense negotiations with American officials had yielded little, and every day the fleet deteriorated in the cold autumn air. Then came an idea, whispered first in the Foreign Office corridors, debated in hushed tones over maps and files. Perhaps there was a way to pay without paying, to keep what was essential without collapsing the nation's fragile finances. The concept was deceptively simple. Instead of purchasing trucks individually, Britain would negotiate a comprehensive settlement covering all Lend-Lease equipment it intended to retain. By aggregating debt across categories, negotiating reductions, and factoring in depreciation, officials could present Washington with a figure that was significant but not ruinous. It required creativity, persistence, and a willingness to bend traditional accounting rules, yet it offered a lifeline. Edward watched as clerks, accountants, and logistics officers worked feverishly, tallying trucks by type, condition, and future use. Every GMC cargo lorry, every Dodge weapons carrier, every Studebaker that had survived the deserts of North Africa or the frozen roads of Germany had to be catalogued, valued, and classified. Meanwhile, American representatives toured the depots, clipboards in hand, inspecting engines, measuring wear, and debating the value of canvas tops and tires. They were firm but not unreasonable, aware that the trucks were both instruments of war and potential competition for post-war American manufacturing. Britain's negotiators used this to their advantage, emphasizing worn vehicles, those nearing the end of service, and the cost of repatriation versus retention. By demonstrating that the bulk of the fleet had been consumed in service, they created leverage, arguing that payment should reflect practical value, not original cost. By December 1945, the plan bore fruit. The Anglo-American financial agreement was signed, establishing a settlement of £650 million for all equipment Britain wished to retain, roughly 10% of the original value. The trucks could remain, crucial for military occupation, post-war reconstruction, and civilian adaptation, while surplus vehicles would be disposed of or sold overseas. Edward walked among the rows of vehicles that had carried soldiers across continents, feeling a cautious relief. The agreement had preserved what was vital, allowing Britain to rebuild without forfeiting the engines of its wartime logistics. At the depot, mechanics began the meticulous process of categorization, which vehicles would continue in military service, which would be transferred to ministries for civilian use, and which were surplus to requirements. Some GMCs and Dodges were destined for road maintenance, others for forestry or municipal work. Each truck retained its stories, scars, and history, yet now they were threads in a vast administrative tapestry, woven through negotiation, accounting, and diplomacy. Edward paused by a Studebaker US 6, imagining the miles it had carried ammunition, food, and hope. Now, through clever accounting and patient negotiation, it would continue to serve, not as a tool of war, but as a foundation for recovery. The process was far from glamorous, yet it was no less heroic than crossing Normandy or the deserts of Libya. Britain had survived the war, and through ingenuity, determination, and a willingness to bend rules, it would survive the post-war storm as well. The wind picked up, rustling the canvas tops of trucks that had become monuments to both struggle and survival. Edward looked down the rows, counting trucks in his mind, realizing that each machine represented more than steel and rubber. They were symbols of endurance, of cooperation across oceans, and of a nation learning the harsh lessons of dependence and debt. Victory had been celebrated with parades and cheers, but the true battle, the one fought in offices, depots, and accounting rooms, had just been won. And so, autumn gave way to winter, the depot alive not with engines but with paperwork, inspection, and cautious hope. Britain had been trapped, nearly crushed by circumstance. Yet through creative accounting, the fleet remained, and with it the capacity to rebuild, to feed its people, and to recover from the ravages of war. Edward stepped back, boots muddy, rain-streaked coat clinging, and allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. They had fought the war, survived its aftermath, and found a path forward. The trucks, silent sentinels of past battles, would now drive the story of Britain's future. Early 1946, the chill of winter had given way to the first gray days of a hesitant spring. Yet the depots across Britain still bristled with olive-drab steel. Edward Carver walked among the GMCs, Dodges, Studebakers, and Diamond tank transporters, their engines silent but their presence enormous. Victory had been months ago, yet Britain's war was far from over. The Anglo-American financial agreement had secured the fleet, but now the enormous task of sorting nearly 500,000 vehicles began. A task as vital as any campaign overseas. Mechanics, clerks, and officers spread across depots at Chilwell, Dunnington, and Bicester, working through mud and frost to inspect, categorize, and document each truck. Every GMC, Dodge, or Studebaker was examined for mileage, mechanical condition, and potential use. Those deemed essential for continued military service, roughly 125,000 vehicles, would form the backbone of occupation forces in Germany. Another 95,000 trucks were approved for civilian use. The Ministry of Transport would take lorries for road repair, the Ministry of Agriculture for forestry, and local authorities for fire brigades, municipal work, and refugee collection. Edward noted the precision and care taken in every decision. One misstep could leave reconstruction crippled or waste precious resources. Outside the depot, the rows of trucks stretched endlessly, a mountain of machines that had survived desert sands, frozen rivers, and bombed-out cities, now waiting for a future in peace. Edward paused beside a Studebaker US-6, its tires cracked but engine promising. It had carried troops across Europe, yet now its mission was different, transporting timber, grain, and hope to a nation rebuilding from ashes. He watched mechanics replace worn parts with components salvaged from older vehicles, a process as delicate as any surgical operation. For the British military, spare parts were increasingly scarce. The Americans had disposed of their own surplus stocks, and workshops began cannibalizing damaged vehicles to keep others running, even manufacturing improvised replacements. Meanwhile, surplus trucks that could not serve military or civilian needs were slated for disposal. Some were sold to private haulage firms, agricultural contractors, and construction companies, providing a modest revenue of millions to the struggling treasury. Others, too worn or remote for recovery, were scrapped, their steel feeding Britain's post-war reconstruction. In more isolated areas, particularly in Scotland and Northern Ireland, clusters of abandoned trucks gradually deteriorated, becoming derelict hulks slowly reclaimed by vegetation. Edward walked past one such row, imagining the vehicle's glory days on battlefields, now reduced to silent monuments of a vanished war. The process extended beyond Britain. Commonwealth nations received transfers of trucks, ensuring that New Zealand, South Africa, and India could meet post-war transport needs. Even in Germany, vehicles deemed surplus were sold cheaply to local firms desperate to rebuild. Edward reflected on the strange afterlife of these machines. They had been tools of war, lifelines and logistics, and now, quietly, they were instruments of recovery and industry, carrying food, materials, and hope across a battered continent. By mid-1946, the British authorities had effectively sorted the fleet. Trucks for military retention, civilian ministries, Commonwealth transfers, and disposal were all accounted for, documented, and set in motion. Edward stood on a small rise, looking over the depot, the sun glinting off rows of olive-drab metal. These trucks, once instruments of global conflict, had survived battles, bureaucracy, frost, and rain. They were now poised to serve a new purpose, rebuilding a nation and a world scarred by war. The task had been grueling, the stakes immense, yet through meticulous inspection, categorization, and administration, Britain had turned chaos into order. The fleet, saved by creative accounting, careful negotiation, and sheer determination, had now found a role in peace. Edward allowed himself a brief smile, knowing that while the war had ended months ago, the real work, sustaining victory and securing recovery, was only just beginning. Between the winter season from 1945 to 46, depots across Britain had transformed into sprawling cities of steel, mud, and relentless human activity. Edward Carver, a lieutenant tasked with overseeing one of the largest depot yards at Chilwell, trudged through the frozen mud, clipboard in hand, breath visible in the biting air. The war was over. Victory parades had come and gone. Yet the aftermath was a battlefield of its own, less glamorous, but no less critical. 500,000 American trucks, GMCs, Dodges, Studebakers, Diamond tank transporters, sat in neatly ordered rows, their olive-drab paint faded, engines silent, tires crusted with frost and grime. Each vehicle had survived deserts, rivers, bombed-out cities, and countless miles of European terrain, only to now face a new kind of test, the meticulous scrutiny of peacetime. The Anglo-American financial agreement had bought Britain the right to retain essential vehicles at a fraction of their original cost, roughly 10%. But securing the trucks was only the beginning. The enormous task of sorting nearly 500,000 vehicles loomed over the nation. Every truck had to be inspected, its condition assessed, mileage logged, and fate determined. Military retention, civilian ministry allocation, domestic sale, scrapping, or transfer abroad. Edward moved along the rows, noting mechanics who worked tirelessly under tattered canvas tops, replacing worn-out parts with components scavenged from older, damaged vehicles. Cannibalizing damaged trucks to keep others running had become an art form, a testament to the ingenuity and necessity of post-war Britain. Approximately 125,000 vehicles were earmarked for continued military service. These trucks would support the British occupation forces in Germany, forming the backbone of transport and logistics across a continent still reeling from war. Another 95,000 were allocated to civilian ministries. GMCs and Dodges for the Ministry of Transport, hauling timber, coal, and crushed stone to rebuild roads and cities. Four-wheel drive trucks for the Ministry of Agriculture, plowing fields and transporting harvests. And Dodge ambulances converted into fire engines for towns still recovering from bombing raids. Edward paused by one Studebaker US-6, its canvas top frayed, engine pocked with scratches and heat stains. It had carried soldiers across frozen rivers and North African deserts. Now it would carry timber and hope across England's recovering landscapes. The sorting was not only a domestic challenge. Across the Channel, in the shattered cities of Germany, roughly 78,000 American trucks were pressed into service by the British Army of the Rhine. Their role was crucial, moving supplies, ferrying personnel, and keeping a fragile peace. Surplus vehicles, deemed unnecessary by military standards, were sold cheaply to German transport companies desperate to restart their businesses. Edward had visited a disposal center in Hamburg months earlier. Rows of Chevrolets, Dodges, and GMCs, repainted and fitted with German plates, waiting to serve once again, this time in civilian hands. It was surreal, seeing machines that had carried soldiers into battle now quietly helping to rebuild a defeated nation, a symbol of continuity amid the chaos of post-war life. Meanwhile, in Britain, the transformation of the civilian landscape was equally dramatic. Towns, farms, and forests, long silent during the war, began to awaken to the rumble of American engines. Dodge ambulances, stripped of stretchers and outfitted with hoses and ladders, became the lifeblood of fire brigades in bombed-out villages. GMCs and Diamond tank transporters hauled timber, stone, and road-building materials, laying the literal foundations of recovery. Four-wheel drive trucks traversed forestry tracts and plowed fields, carrying crops, livestock, and firewood across uneven terrain. Their durability, simple engineering, and ease of maintenance made them indispensable in areas where British vehicles were scarce or slow to arrive. Yet, these machines were not without their flaws. Fuel consumption remained a constant challenge. Designed for cheap and abundant American petrol, engines guzzled fuel at a time when rationing continued across Britain. Operators quickly learned that running a GMC or Dodge was a luxury they could not always afford. By the late 1940s, many civilian users gradually replaced their American trucks with smaller, more economical British models. Still, for the first crucial years of Reconstruction, the fleet was unmatched. These trucks carried food, materials, and people, knitting together a nation still fragile from war, and connecting towns, farms, and cities in a rhythm of recovery. Edward often reflected on the human side of this quiet triumph. Every truck told a story. The soldiers who had relied on them in deserts, the mechanics who had repaired them in rain and mud, the clerks who had logged every tire, every engine part, every mile. He watched a young mechanic adjusting a GMC's engine, his hands blackened with oil, and thought of the lives that truck had supported in North Africa, Italy, and Normandy. Now it carried the weight of peace. Timber to rebuild a school, flour to feed a village, coal to warm homes. The transformation was subtle, almost invisible, but profound. By mid-1946, the sorting effort was largely complete. Trucks for military retention, civilian ministries, Commonwealth transfers, and domestic sale were all accounted for, documented, and set in motion. Those too worn for service faced scrapping, their steel feeding Britain's reconstruction. In remote regions, particularly in Scotland and Northern Ireland, clusters of abandoned trucks slowly deteriorated, eventually reclaimed by vegetation, relics of a war and a nation in flux. Edward walked past one such hulk, imagining its glory days transporting soldiers across Europe, now a silent monument to endurance, loss, and recovery. In towns and countryside alike, the trucks became indispensable. Dodge ambulances raced through narrow streets to fires. GMCs pulled stone and timber across newly repaired roads. Four-wheel drives transported crops and firewood across frozen fields. Communities learned to maintain them, often improvising parts or borrowing from scrapped vehicles. The machines had once been instruments of war, now engines of recovery, quietly shaping post-war Britain. For Edward, watching the transformation felt like witnessing history itself. The same trucks that had carried men into battle now carried the future on their heavy, oil-stained wheels. Through meticulous inspection, careful administration, and sheer determination, Britain had turned chaos into order. The trucks, survivors of war and bureaucracy alike, were finally doing what they were meant to do, serving the nation, both military and civilian, in a delicate dance of recovery. Edward stepped back from a row of Studebakers, noting their scars and the stories etched into each dent and scratch. Victory had come with guns and glory, but survival, reconstruction, and the quiet triumph of these machines, driving timber, coal, and hope across a weary land would define the post-war era for generations to come. From 1947 to 1953, victory parades were a memory. Cities had been rebuilt, food rationing slowly eased, and the guns of war had fallen silent. Yet for the British military, a quieter but no less relentless battle continued. The struggle to keep 500,000 American trucks, now reduced to a smaller, essential fleet, running across the country and its far-flung garrisons. Edward Carver, now promoted to oversee military vehicle logistics for the Midlands region, walked through the depots at Dunnington. The rows of GMCs, Dodges, Studebakers, and Diamond tank transporters had dwindled since the massive post-war sorting. Yet each remaining truck carried an extraordinary burden. They were lifelines for the army, occupation forces, and essential transport. Yet their engines were aging, their parts vanishing, and their days in service numbered. Spare parts had become a constant concern. The Americans, having disposed of their own surplus stocks by 1948, no longer manufactured replacement components for wartime models. Workshops across Britain adapted, cannibalizing damaged trucks to keep others running, often improvising parts in makeshift engineering shops. Engineers fabricated replacement axles, brake components, and even transmission parts from steel scavenged from scrapped vehicles. Edward inspected a Dodge WC series weapons carrier, noting the makeshift repairs that allowed it to continue hauling ammunition in Germany. The vehicle bore scars from war and repairs alike, yet it remained essential. The ingenuity of mechanics and the resourcefulness of workshops became as critical to post-war security as strategy or training. By 1949, the military fleet had shrunk to roughly 73,000 trucks. Many older models, worn from years of service across deserts, Europe, and Asia, were no longer economically reparable. Yet the Army's needs had not diminished. Occupation duties in Germany, the protection of overseas garrisons, and domestic military exercises demanded a reliable transport network. Some of the newest GMC and Studebaker models continued to serve, while others were gradually phased out. Edward watched soldiers carefully maintain each truck, aware that a single failure could disrupt operations, supplies, or training schedules. Each vehicle represented not only industrial power but also human lives and national security. The early 1950s brought further pressures. The Korean War erupted in 1950, sending shockwaves across military planning worldwide. Britain, though not a principal combatant in Korea, faced increased demands for heavy transport and logistics support for deployments and training. This temporary crisis extended the service life of some heavy American trucks, particularly those already stationed in overseas garrisons or required for specialized transport. Diamond tank transporters, originally designed to carry British armor from Normandy to the Rhine, hauled supplies across training ranges and ports, their engines straining under loads far heavier than intended. Even as workshops worked tirelessly, the trucks were aging visibly. Cracked tires, patched canvas tops, and mismatched parts bore witness to both history and necessity. Despite these efforts, decline was inevitable. By 1953, only 28,000 American trucks remained in military service, most of them specialized vehicles or units stationed overseas where spare parts were still available. The majority of general-purpose trucks had either been scrapped, sold into civilian hands, or cannibalized for parts. Edward walked past a Studebaker US 6, noting the faded paint and dented fenders. Once it had carried soldiers across frozen European rivers. Now it would soon be retired or repurposed. The Army's reliance on American trucks, so critical during the war, had become a double-edged sword. Their simplicity and durability were unmatched, yet dependence on foreign-made vehicles had created a vulnerability. The lessons were clear. Britain needed domestic production capacity to ensure the survival and independence of its military logistics. The decline of the fleet was not merely practical. It carried symbolic weight. Trucks that had once dominated European battlefields, that had transported men, munitions, and hope, were now disappearing from the military landscape. Many ended up in civilian hands, purchased by haulage firms, agricultural contractors, and municipal services, where they often continued to serve for years beyond their intended lifespan. Others were scrapped, their steel feeding post-war reconstruction. Edward remembered walking past a scrapyard in Birmingham where rows of Chevrolets and Dodges had been cut apart, the air thick with smoke and sparks. These machines, once instruments of global conflict, were reduced to raw materials. Their presence felt only indirectly in roads, bridges, and buildings. The Korean War years were a brief reprieve for the remaining fleet, extending the operational lives of some trucks. Yet even this temporary lifeline could not stop the overall trend. Maintenance costs rose, parts became harder to source, and the Army increasingly pushed for standardization on British models. The Bedford RL series, designed in the early 1950s, reflected lessons learned from the American trucks: simplicity, ease of maintenance, and standardized components to avoid the vulnerabilities of foreign dependence. Edward had attended planning meetings where engineers and strategists debated which American models were essential to keep, which could be replaced, and which must be retired. The decisions were informed not by glory, but by practicality, economy, and foresight. By the mid-1950s, surviving American trucks had largely taken on specialized roles. Some remained in overseas garrisons, where supply chains allowed for maintenance and parts, while a handful found their way into civilian life, often continuing as fire engines, forestry trucks, or farm vehicles. Museums occasionally acquired examples, though few paid attention to common military trucks during the 1940s and 1950s. The Imperial War Museum later obtained a GMC CCKW 2.5-ton lorry, and the National Motor Museum secured a Dodge WC series. These trucks, once ubiquitous, had become artifacts, reminders of the logistical backbone of victory. Edward, walking one last time through the depots, reflected on the fleet's extraordinary journey. From battlefields across North Africa and Europe to reconstruction sites, rural forests, and overseas garrisons, the American trucks had been instruments of war and tools of peace. Their decline was inevitable, but their impact was enduring. Britain had learned hard lessons about dependency, maintenance, and industrial independence, shaping policy for decades to come. What remained was a smaller, leaner fleet, battle-scarred yet still vital, and the memory of a time when 500,000 machines had carried the weight of a world at war and the burden of rebuilding it. While Britain bargains and sorts, the Soviets do something shocking. They keep everything. Trucks that crossed continents under Lend-Lease continued in Soviet service into the 1960s. As Britain meticulously accounted for every GMC, Dodge, and Studebaker, sorting, repairing, selling, or scrapping, Soviet forces simply retained their entire fleet. Studebaker US-6S carried supplies across Siberia, GMCs moved troops, and Dodges hauled equipment decades after the guns had fallen silent. The contrast could not have been starker. Britain adhered to agreements, balanced budgets, and negotiated settlements, while the USSR focused purely on utility, ignoring international expectations. This divergence became an early flashpoint of the Cold War. The same trucks, symbols of Allied cooperation, now highlighted ideological and strategic differences. Britain's careful disposal and negotiated retention illustrated a nation grappling with scarcity, diplomacy, and post-war recovery, while the Soviet Union's retention reflected a focus on self-sufficiency and control. Back in Britain, the civilian afterlife of the vehicles was profound. GMCs and Dodges hauled timber, road materials, and agricultural produce. Ambulances became fire engines. Four-wheel drive trucks worked forests and farms. Their robustness, simplicity, and ease of maintenance allowed them to remain valuable even under petrol rationing. Small businesses and municipal services grew around these surplus vehicles, extending their lives well beyond military service. Meanwhile, British military workshops cannibalized older trucks to keep others running. Spare parts grew scarce as American production ceased, forcing engineers to improvise replacements. By the early 1950s, the military fleet had dwindled, confined mainly to specialized vehicles in overseas garrisons, while Soviet trucks continued rolling unimpeded, decades old but operational. Within 5 years, most trucks are gone, scrapped, sold, abandoned. Within 2 decades, they are rare. The machines that carried victory vanished almost without a trace. By 1948, roughly 67,000 American trucks in Britain had been scrapped, their steel feeding a nation rebuilding from rubble. Thousands more were sold to private firms, agricultural contractors, construction companies, and municipal authorities. GMCs hauled timber, Dodges plowed fields, and even worn vehicles found new purposes in local services. Remote depots in Scotland and Northern Ireland saw clusters of abandoned trucks slowly decay, left where transport costs made recovery uneconomical. Yet a handful survived by chance and foresight. Museums gradually acquired iconic vehicles. The Imperial War Museum collected a GMC CCKW 2.5-ton lorry. The National Motor Museum preserved a Dodge WC weapons carrier, and a few Studebaker US-6S found their way into collections. From the 1970s onward, private collectors began discovering working examples decades old. In farm sheds, scrapyards, and municipal depots, restoring them as tangible reminders of a fleet that had once spanned continents. These surviving trucks were rare exceptions. Out of roughly 480,000 vehicles that had served Britain and its empire, only a fraction endured. Their disappearance demonstrates how even massive logistical programs, so critical to victory, can vanish almost entirely when war ends and economic, practical, and political pressures take over. These trucks were not glamorous like tanks or rockets, but their story teaches a lesson. Victory is only the beginning. Logistics, money, and planning decide who survives the war and who vanishes. The American trucks left a lasting imprint on British military and industrial thinking. Engineers studied their simple, robust designs, drawing lessons for ease of maintenance, standardization, and durability. The Bedford RL series of the 1950s, among others, reflected these lessons, with streamlined components and service-friendly engineering. Beyond design, the experience shaped policy. The dangers of overdependence on foreign equipment became clear, and subsequent British governments prioritized domestic production of critical military assets to avoid vulnerability. In civilian life, these trucks quietly rebuilt Britain. GMCs, Dodges, and Studebakers transported goods, fueled reconstruction, and supported local economies. Communities learned to maintain and operate them efficiently, skills that lasted long after the vehicles themselves disappeared. Yet, within 2 decades, most trucks had vanished, scrapped, sold, or abandoned. Today, fewer than 100 survive in museums and private collections, tangible ghosts of 500,000 that once carried victory across deserts, rivers, and cities. Victory, therefore, was only the beginning. The quiet battles of administration, negotiation, and logistics shaped Britain's recovery, influenced policy for decades, and left an enduring mark on engineering, industry, and civilian life. The truck story is a reminder that wars are won not only with guns and strategy, but with supply lines, planning, and the ability to manage the machines that move men and materials across continents.